Fiscal Responsibility Bill is one of the potential pieces of legislation getting prime attention from lawmakers in the National Assembly. What are the possible merits and drawbacks to this bill? And to what extent can it go in plugging the identified loopholes in government business? We're now going back to our Abuja studio for a chat on this very important matter with Eze Onyekpere, lawyer and fiscal governance expert. Good morning, Eze Onyekpere, and welcome to the morning show.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. Well, you've been very vocal about the Fiscal Responsibility Act and attempts to ignore critical sections of it by government. In December, there was a finance bill that was taken to the National Assembly by the executive arm of government, and that finance bill tries to amend almost about 12 existing legislations, and you had cause to complain about it, and particularly what the bill seeks to do with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. If you may just comment on that.
Well, very well. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is an old piece of legislation. It's been there since 2007. But unfortunately, the dreams and the aspirations and the goals that the Act set out to achieve have, up till date, not been achieved. And what we were complaining about is the idea that you use one piece of legislation to amend about 12 other laws. And then these are 12 other detailed laws requiring different competencies and professionals to attend to them. So they are not just laws you wake up in the morning and just put in one basket and amend. You need to sit down carefully and weigh all the options and the issues, get the proper professionals and competencies to have a proper discussion, and then throw it out to the public before you now sit down to say you want to amend. And that's why we are happy with the proposed amendments to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is quite detailed and has been with the National Assembly for some time. So this gives a proper opportunity for all stakeholders to come on board, consider the issues dispassionately, and then begin to take them clause by clause to arrive at a decision that makes sense.
So why do you think that it's been so difficult to adhere to this Fiscal Responsibility Act and the role of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission? What would you identify as the major challenges here?
Well, there are quite a number of them. But the first one is that the Act was drafted in such a way that was loose and woolly, in the sense that you give a commission powers to, ensure fiscal responsibility, to make sure that the economic objectives of state that are enshrined in Section 16 of the Constitution are enforced. But after stating out all they need to do, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you now make duties for public servants on what they should do. But there are no sanctions. There is no enforcement platform. There's no enforcement mechanism. So if you tell me, Eze, you must wake up by 5 o'clock in the morning, and if I decide continually to be waking up by 6, and there are no sanctions, because, of course, in legal jurisprudence, some define law as the command of the sovereign backed by sanctions. So if you simply make do's and don'ts, there are no penalties, there are no incentives. It's just like, if you want, you do it. If you don't want, nothing happens. So that's the principal challenge with this act, why it is obeyed in the breach. People simply ignore it, because what will the commission do to you? What are the sanctions stated in the law? Some of us who followed the passage of the law before 2007, the original drafts has sanctions. But of course, the political leaders who were supposed to be sanctioned quickly came and complained. How do you want to sanction us for a little mismanagement of the fiscal resources? They now place the sanctions on the public servants, the permanent secretaries, and the directors. Of course, all of them came together and said, come on, why would we simply be doing our work, and sometimes we're under the pen of punishment to obey the political leaders, and you now say the sanctions will be on us? So they quickly made a case, and the whole sanctions regime in the Act was removed. So that's why you have a very beautiful do's and don'ts, but nobody to enforce and no sanctions for disobeying it.
But if you don't have sanctions for disobeying it, it's as good as not having a law in the first place. We'll go on a break. We'll come back. We'll talk some more. Right, welcome back. So we still have Eze Onyekpere, lawyer and fiscal governance expert. So like I was saying, if there are no penalties, then what's the reason for the laws in the first place? Because it's almost null and void. I mean, there are no penalties, no retribution for the action. But isn't it incumbent on us to revisit this based on what is happening? Physical indiscipline has destroyed
very well.
our
That's
country.
why we have this bill.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Very
sir.
well. That's why we have this bill currently before the National Assembly. And the bill seeks to look at these challenges based on the history of experience, the practice so far, and to plug these leaks, to plug the leaks. If you recall, we are in our second recession under 4 or 5 years. And part of the challenge the government is facing is that agencies that are supposed to remit the operating surplus to the federal government and to the treasury are not doing that. And the beauty of these recommendations that are contained in this bill now is that we will now have a system where the commission will be specifically empowered to seek to enforce these provisions to get the independent revenue back to the federal government. And then people will now be compelled, the managers of these institutions will now be compelled by law to file reports with the commission, testify under oath, and of course they will now have the power to investigate and upscale it to the anti-corruption agencies. And of course, if somebody is found out to have tried to defraud the treasury through improper accounting of the operating surplus, then there will be a penalty. The projection out there is that what we are realizing today in independent revenue for the federal government, we can almost times it by 4 if the leaks are properly plugged. Now, the other component of it, which is also good, is that if you look at over 13 years of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, all that they've gotten from the Treasury is about 5.something billion naira. And this is not the way to fund an agency that we think should do serious work. We are all there. The bill is also saying that at least some little thing from that bill, some little money that they recover should be used to fund the commission. And of course, remove the commission from the purview of pure politics. If you simply say a commission should just be there and there should be representatives per geopolitical zones, you create the impression of politics. This is supposed to be a technocratic institution where you have the best hands. So part of the amendments is also recommending that you take this thing away from politics, get the technocrats, get the right persons to go and manage the place, and then produce results. Then in terms of bringing the medium-term expenditure framework, which is there before the budget, a time frame, proper time frame has been put in the amendment, and it will help the budget to be prepared early. And then the consultations in the act, which we have said you may, which is like there's a discretion, experience has also shown that what has happened, there's many times people are not consulted. And even if there's a consultation, it is merely perfunctory. So the act is now proposing, the amendment is now proposing that it should be compulsory, that certain stakeholders should be consulted, and there should be evidence of that consultation brought to bear on the medium-term expenditure framework. And of course, also, if you do this thing religiously and do it properly, it will help to influence the quality of the budget and also the timing of the budget presentation. Although I admit that if we want to amend the timing of budget presentation, we have to go back to Section 81 of the Constitution because it just says at any time. But if you do the background work very well, it will also help you to present a good budget and to present it on time. And the beauty of all this now is that all those agencies that are fully funded by the federal government, their whole IGR may now have to get back to the Treasury. And all these monies we are trying to borrow left, right, and center, we may not have the need, we may reduce them if the regime being proposed in the amendment is brought to life. Furthermore, there's the issue of borrowing, which is on the exclusive legislative list, both for the federal, state, and local governments. Everybody has to be in accordance with federal law. Now, even though the Fiscal Responsibility Act says you can only borrow for capital expenditure or developmental purposes, and that you must produce a cost-benefit analysis for the projects you want to do, it must be on concessional basis. And concessional basis is defined as less than 3% interest per annum in terms of the interest you have to pay. And there must have to be a long period of amortization so that the situation will be such that is sustainable. But what we have today is not sustainable because nobody is implementing, nobody is trying to enforce those provisions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. By the new proposed amendments, that will be reined in. So we can't have this scenario where everybody's like we are going on a borrowing bridge and nobody is trying to look into it to see if the rules and regulations have been complied with.
Well, Eze, let me ask you, one of the concerns expressed by your group, the Center for Social Justice, has to do with the Section 85 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, dealing with the excess crude account. Now, that excess crude account has dropped by about 98%. It's down to, I think the last report indicated about, is it $72 million? Now, what are the kind of lessons we can learn from what has happened to oil revenue in the context of COVID-19 and the slush fund available in the excess crude account just disappearing more or less?
Well, the lessons are clear. That account was supposed to be a rainy day account. And the Fiscal Responsibility Act have made clear guidelines on how it should be managed. And if you look at the Appropriation Act every year, the National Assembly says any amount in excess of the benchmark price should go to that fund. And the Act says you cannot withdraw from the fund unless the price of crude oil falls below the benchmark continuously for a period of 3 months. And you can only withdraw from it to augment your budget to come up to the level that you should have been if not for the drop in crude oil revenue. So the lesson is not for the arguments of whether the excess crude account should be there or not. The lesson should be how do we reinforce that account so that going forward, money should enter there and not come out unless and until the conditions stated in the law have been met. For instance, if we had some money there, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 billion, the amount of money we are borrowing, all those things, money that the federal government is giving to states, looking for money from the World Bank, or even doing senior rate from the CBN, would have been very, very reduced. We have had something to fall back upon. So for me, going forward, it is not whether we are to scrap the fund or whether we are to maintain it. We have to maintain it, but then draw very strong rules and regulations so that it doesn't become what you are calling it, a slush fund. It was not created or designed to be a slush fund, but it is the managers who have converted it to a slush fund.
Well, this one, do we still have time?
We're told that's all we can take at
Well,
this time.
thank you very much, Eze Onyekpere, for joining us on the morning show today.